Pryor, you listen to me. I don't care what you do once this thing's over with. You can lay down and die and rot in the street.
For an entire generation of television viewers, there was one figure on the Ponderosa who never needed to raise his voice to be the heart of the show. Hoss Cartwright, played by Dan Blocker, was the gentlest giant in the history of the American Western, a man whose size was matched only by the size of his compassion. Decades after his sudden death, his son Dirk Blocker, himself a working actor now in his 60s, has spent recent years speaking more openly than ever about who his father really was behind the legend. What emerges isn't a scandal or a secret kept locked away for 50 years. It's something quieter and in its own way more affecting. Confirmation of everything fans always sensed was true, that the warmth Dan Blocker brought to the screen wasn't a performance at all. It was simply who he was. To understand why that confirmation matters, it helps to go back to the beginning, long before Hollywood, long before the Ponderosa, to a small Texas town where a boy who would one day tower over every soundstage in America was already impossible to miss. Dan Blocker was born Bobby Dan Davis Blocker on December 10, 1928, in DeKalb, Texas, and by most family accounts he arrived weighing an extraordinary 14 pounds, a detail that would follow him, half-joking, for the rest of his life. He grew up in the small town of O'Donnell, Texas, where his family ran a grocery store, and it was there, among sacks of flour and crates of produce, that young Dan learned the rhythms of hard work and small-town decency that would define him long after he'd left Texas behind. By the time he was 10 years old, Dan was already working alongside grown men, hauling grain and doing construction labor that would have exhausted boys twice his age. He grew fast and grew big. By 12 he stood 6 feet tall and weighed 200 pounds, a size that earned him the nickname, the Big Un, among people who knew him. He was never a bully, though. Those who tried to test him quickly learned that his strength was matched by an unusual gentleness, a pattern that would define him for the rest of his life. At Texas Military Institute and later at Sul-Ross State University, where he played football on an athletic scholarship, Blocker cut an imposing figure, 6'4" and pushing 275 pounds. But it was almost by accident that his path bent toward acting. The college drama department needed someone strong enough to help move heavy set pieces, and Blocker, ever obliging, volunteered. That small favor turned into a bit part in a college production of Arsenic and Old Lace, and something in him lit up. He switched his major from English to theater, turned down chances to play professional football, and set his sights instead on the stage. Eventually that ambition carried him to New York, where he found work in a production of King Lear and began slowly to build the foundation of a career that would one day make him a household name. Before Hollywood came, though, there was Korea. After college, Blocker enlisted in the U.S. Army, and his size, by then over 6'3" and nearly 300 pounds, created logistical headaches from day one. It reportedly took the Army a month to find boots large enough for him. He was deployed as a combat infantry sergeant with the 179th Infantry Regiment, and by the winter of 1951, he was serving near the front lines in North Korea during some of the war's fiercest fighting, including combat near Pork Chop Hill. Blocker spent months enduring brutal winter conditions and sustained combat. During one engagement, he moved through heavy fire to help a wounded comrade reach safety, an act that left him injured and earned him the Purple Heart. He rarely spoke about the specifics of what he witnessed in Korea, but those who knew him well said the war left a permanent mark. He returned home changed, more skeptical of military force as a solution, more outspoken against war generally. And in later years, he became known among friends and colleagues for his strong feelings about the human cost of conflict, sentiments shaped directly by what he'd lived through on those hillsides. Back in civilian life, Blocker married his college sweetheart, Dolphia Parker, and the two would eventually raise 4 children together, including Dirk. For a while, acting wasn't even a plan. Blocker moved to California to pursue a doctorate in education at UCLA. But his imposing frame, warm Texas drawl, and natural screen presence caught the attention of casting agents at a moment when television was hungry for Western actors, and Blocker began picking up small roles in genre staples like Gunsmoke and Colt .45. Throughout the late 1950s, he built a steady resume, appearing in The Rifleman, Have Gun, Will Travel, and Maverick, gradually shifting from bit player to recognizable character actor. A meaningful break came with a substantial role in The Restless Gun, followed by a recurring part as a good-natured ranch hand in Cimarron City, a role that let him show off the easy comedic timing that would later become one of Hoss Cartwright's defining traits. By the time NBC came calling for a new Western series about a widowed rancher and his 3 very different sons, Dan Blocker was ready. Bonanza premiered in 1959, and almost overnight, Dan Blocker became inseparable from the character of Eric Hoss Cartwright, where his TV brother Little Joe, played by Michael Landon, brought youthful charm. Hoss brought something rarer on network television at the time: uncomplicated, unguarded kindness. Hoss wasn't written as the sharpest of the Cartwright sons, but audiences, especially children, responded to his honesty, his loyalty, and the sense that no matter what happened on the Ponderosa, Hoss would always do right by the people he loved. For Blocker, the role became something closer to a personal philosophy expressed through fiction. He often spoke about being drawn to the idea, associated with the 18th century Quaker missionary Stephen Grellet, of doing all the good one can while one has the chance. Colleagues noted that the sense of fairness and protectiveness Hoss displayed on screen wasn't invented for the camera. It mirrored the man playing him. That authenticity is part of what made the character resonate so deeply. Audiences could sense, even without knowing the details of Blocker's life, that the warmth was real. It's worth noting that the gentle giant persona obscured just how sharp Blocker actually was off camera. He held a master's degree in theater, read widely, and was known among cast and crew as a thoughtful, well-informed conversationalist, a contrast to Hoss's simplicity that friends found quietly funny. Behind the scenes, he formed a close bond with co-stars Lorne Greene and Michael Landon. The 3 shared enough trust that Blocker stood as best man at Landon's wedding to Lynn No, a detail that speaks to how deep those friendships ran beyond the soundstage. Fame reshaped his life quickly. Bonanza became one of the most watched shows in America, and Blocker found himself recognized everywhere he went. A strange adjustment for a man who had spent his childhood in a town small enough that everyone already knew his name. Family vacations sometimes turned into impromptu public appearances. One trip to the Yucatan, meant as a quiet getaway, became a spectacle once locals recognized Hoss walking down the street. By 1970, the toll of that visibility had become something Blocker wanted to step back from, at least partially. Inspired by photographs of the Swiss Lake country he'd seen in National Geographic, he and his family relocated to Switzerland, drawn by the scenery around Lake Como and Lugano and the promise of a quieter pace of life. There, Bonanza aired dubbed in German, which meant Blocker could walk through town largely unrecognized, a small, hard-won freedom he clearly valued. Rumors circulated that financial trouble had pushed the move, but Blocker dismissed that outright. Bonanza had made him financially comfortable, and the relocation was about reclaiming privacy, not solving money problems. He continued flying back to the United States regularly to film, never abandoning the show that had made him famous, even as he built a different kind of life for his children abroad. Despite his wealth, Blocker remained unusually self-aware about privilege. He spoke candidly, including in interviews late in his career, about the irony of his success, at one point acknowledging with characteristic bluntness that he'd essentially sold out for money, a comment less about regret than about staying honest with himself about how fortune works. He often expressed particular sympathy for underpaid teachers and toyed, more than once, with the idea of eventually returning to education, though his fame as Hoss made a quiet second act increasingly unrealistic. One story from the Bonanza years has followed Blocker's legacy for decades, and it says as much about his character as anything he ever did on screen. While the cast was filming on location in the American South during the 1960s, at a time when segregation was still legally and culturally entrenched across much of the region, the production arrived at a hotel that refused to accommodate the show's black cast and crew members. Blocker's response was immediate and unequivocal. If the hotel wouldn't house everyone, it wouldn't house any of them. Full stop. It wasn't a negotiating position. It was a line he simply wasn't willing to cross. That instinct showed up elsewhere too. In a 1964 interview, Blocker was characteristically direct about his contempt for bullying in any form, describing himself as someone who avoided conflict but would never stand by while someone larger took advantage of someone smaller. For a man whose physical size alone could have made him intimidating, the consistent theme in nearly every account of his behavior off-screen is that he saw his strength as a responsibility toward others, not a tool for dominance. For all his seriousness about justice and fairness, Blocker was also famous among friends and crew for an appetite that matched his frame. Breakfast alone might include a dozen eggs and multiple loaves of bread. As the day went on, his plate rarely lacked meat, potatoes, and bread, and he had little patience for vegetables, but a well-known soft spot for pies, cakes, and cookies. His Texas roots showed clearly in his food preferences. A whole roasted ham was, by multiple accounts, well within his capacity to finish solo. That appetite eventually became a business venture. Blocker became a co-owner of the Ponderosa Steakhouse chain, named in a nod to the Cartwright family ranch, and the restaurants leaned into exactly the kind of hearty, unpretentious meals he loved. Managing his weight for the cameras, however, became an ongoing struggle in later seasons. The show reportedly used padding at times to maintain Hoss's larger-than-life screen presence, as Blocker's weight fluctuated with the demands of dieting and the abundance of food always available on set. By the early 1970s, as political unrest around the Vietnam War intensified in the United States, Blocker's family life remained centered in Switzerland, even as he kept commuting back for filming. Then, in 1972, what should have been a routine medical procedure changed everything. Blocker was diagnosed with gallstones and underwent gallbladder surgery, a common operation, and one that initially appeared successful. But in the days that followed, he developed a pulmonary embolism, a sudden and often fatal blood clot. And on May 13, 1972, at Daniel Freeman Hospital in Inglewood, California, Dan Blocker died. He was 43 years old. The loss stunned everyone connected to Bonanza and devastated fans across the country. In the years since, one particular rumor has become part of Hollywood folklore. The claim that Blocker's size required him to be buried in a custom-built piano crate rather than a standard casket. It's a colorful story, and an understandable one given his stature, but it isn't true. Blocker was laid to rest in a conventional casket at Woodlawn Cemetery in Santa Monica. The myth persists mostly because it feels fitting for a man whose presence, in life, always seemed larger than the room could contain. Losing a lead actor mid-run is always a crisis for a long-running series. But Bonanza's producers made an unusual choice. Rather than writing Hoss out quietly or ignoring the loss, they addressed Dan Blocker's death directly within the story. Michael Landon, who had grown especially close to Blocker, took on the difficult task of writing the first episode to air after his death. Rather than explaining Hoss's absence outright, Landon leaned into silence and unspoken grief among the Cartwright family, trusting the audience to feel the loss the same way the cast did. Filming that episode was, by all accounts, an emotional ordeal for everyone involved. The set that had once been full of Blocker's booming laughter now carried a heaviness that never fully lifted. Bonanza's ratings, already softening, declined further after Blocker's death. NBC eventually shifted the series out of its long-held Sunday night slot into a Tuesday time period where it faced stiff competition from ABC's movie franchise, and the show struggled to recapture its earlier momentum. After 14 seasons, NBC canceled Bonanza in 1973. Blocker himself, in interviews before his death, had spoken with surprising foresight about the show's mortality, predicting that rising costs and the sheer number of episodes would eventually make the series unsustainable for the network. A prediction that, sadly, he didn't live to see play out without him. Dirk Blocker was still a young man when his father died, and by his own account in interviews over the years, that loss shaped him profoundly, not just emotionally, but professionally. Despite following his father into acting, Dirk gravitated deliberately toward character work rather than leading man visibility. A choice he has linked directly to watching his father struggle with the loss of privacy that came with being one of the most recognized faces in America. Where Dan Blocker couldn't take his family on a simple vacation without being swarmed, Dirk seemed to want a career that let him work without inviting that same level of public attention. In the years since, as he's reflected publicly on his father's life, what Dirk Blocker has confirmed isn't some hidden scandal. It's the thing longtime fans always suspected watching Hoss Cartwright on screen. That Dan Blocker's warmth wasn't a character trait invented by writers. It was simply an extension of who he already was, a man shaped by a hard Texas childhood, tempered by the brutality of war, and guided afterward by a stubborn insistence on fairness, generosity, and decency, both in front of the cameras and, just as importantly, when nobody was watching at all. That, in the end, may be the real confession, hiding inside this story. Not a secret kept for 50 years, but a quiet, repeated confirmation from those who knew him best, that the character audiences loved and the man underneath him were never really two different people at all.